am a lawyer, but I am not necessarily your lawyer. The materials discussed in this podcast are for informational purposes only and should not be deemed legal advice. If you have a specific legal question according to your circumstances, then I encourage you to speak with an attorney licensed in your jurisdiction. Welcome back to another edition of Ag Law Today. We've got Beth Rumley back in the house. We're talking slaughter and processing laws today. Beth, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, Cari?
So I know you're still at the National Ag Law Center. So remind our listeners about what does the National Ag Law Center do? What do you do for them? And a little bit more about your background.
I'm happy to. So I'm a senior staff attorney at the National Agricultural Law Center, and we focus on research, information, and education for areas of the law where they impact agriculture. We're not a law firm. We don't represent people. Instead, our goal is to educate people about what the law is now. We're not working on advocacy or policy organization or anything like that. And at the center, I focus on legal issues in animal agriculture, which is why we're talking today about the slaughter and processing.
So, Beth, I don't know if I've ever asked you this question. How did you fall into food and agriculture law? What's your background?
Well, I'm from a small town in Michigan in the far southeastern corner, and my family has a row crop and specialty crop operation. That's what they call it now, but my family has gone to the farmer's market in our town for 8 generations, which is something that I'm very proud of. And as far as how I got into animal ag, that's actually a really great question and one I'm not sure the answer either. It was just something that I started getting involved in when I started at the center, and it stuck around after that.
So did you go to law school because you wanted to do ag law, or did you just go to law school and then fell into ag law naturally afterwards?
I did not go to law school for ag law. I was going to be a prosecutor, and I was going to be a prosecutor actually up until the time I graduated law school, and they were in a hiring freeze. And so I said, okay, I have a year to fill before this hiring freeze is lifted. And so I decided to go to Arkansas to earn my LLM, my Master of Laws in Agricultural Law, just as a way to sort of fill in that gap. And I got down here, took the classes, started working at the center, and life happened after that.
Yeah, one thing after another. I mean, I think that's an interesting point, and also kind of reminds me a little bit of COVID, only because you can only plan so much in life, right? And then life changes. It throws you
Yes.
a curveball. And speaking of curveballs, how has the National Ag Law Center been with COVID? Have you guys all been working remotely?
Well, so my husband and I are both ag lawyers, and we both work at the National Ag Law Center. And so we have not been working remotely because we have small children at home, and the thought of trying to work with those small children there it wouldn't happen. So thankfully we've been able to come in during most of COVID. My mom has been visiting, and so she's been taking care of the kids while we come in, and we're like the only ones in the building though. So it's very different than it has been.
Yeah, it sure is. So let's get right to the topic. We're talking slaughter and processing laws and regulations. So I'm curious, Beth, why the current interest?
Well, as you mentioned, COVID happened, and with COVID, a lot of plants, processing plants and facilities were impacted because their employees got sick and had to be out for extended periods of time, which cut down on the production, which sort of made a backlog of animals that were meant to go to those plants and be slaughtered in those plants. But because they either were too old or too big then to go into the plants, a lot of them had to be euthanized and disposed of. At the same time, this is something that's been happening for several decades, but we have a lessening number, a smaller number of smaller slaughter plants. And I don't know what it's like in your area, but from people I'm talking to, if they want to get animals in to be slaughtered, they're talking anywhere from 4 months to 18 months wait before they can get a slaughter date, a kill date.
Beth, I can tell you just for my goats alone, I had to call about 6 different facilities, and I finally was able to get reservations 2 at a time in March, April, and May. And that was, I think I made those reservations about 4 months ago. So
Yeah. And it's not just goats, it's a lot of animals. It's large animals and poultry and pretty much anything you can think of that folks are just, they're having a hard time finding places where their animals can be slaughtered. And whether they want to just slaughter them for themselves, or they want to sell it and have it custom slaughtered, or if they want to, get involved with more direct marketing and try to sell beef by the pound, for example, to
mhm.
folks that are interested.
So when you use the word custom slaughter, just so we're all on the same page, what does that mean exactly?
So custom slaughter is slaughtering at a facility that does not have inspection the entire time the animal is being slaughtered and processed. So if you are a custom slaughter facility, you don't have as many requirements in terms of the record keeping, the facility maintenance, and what standards, health standards it needs to meet. And as I said, the most important one is you don't have somebody watching you, an inspector watching you at all times. The other side of that is custom slaughter facilities can only slaughter animals that are going to be used by the owner or the owner's family. So how this works in practice is you sell me a goat. The goat is still alive, and I purchase the whole thing to be slaughtered and processed and to go into my freezer. You make arrangements with the processing facility, and I will then pay you for the goat, and I will pay the processing facility the amount to slaughter and process that animal. And so this works with goats, it works with poultry, it works even with larger animals like cows. So for example, if you have a steer that you want to have custom slaughtered, you can sell it to, for example, 4 people. Each of them can buy a quarter of that animal. You make arrangements to take it to the facility, and all 4 of them call the facility and say, this is how I would like mine cut up. This is how I would like it processed. And they're basically, the custom processor is selling their skills. They're not selling the animal itself. And in doing so, the end result is all 4 of those people have a quarter of that beef to take home and put into their freezer, but they can't sell it. And you can't either as the producer of that animal. You can't sell it by the pound, for example. You have to sell it on the hoof if you're engaging in custom slaughter sales.
That's why they have those big stickers or stamps,
That's why
not
they
for
have,
sale.
that's exactly right, yeah.
So let's big picture, Beth, what are the different kinds of processing facilities?
So in terms of inspection, we have federally inspected plants, we have state inspected plants, and we have non-inspected plants. And those would be the custom slaughter plants. And they obviously, by the titles, you can sort of guess what the difference is between them. When you're looking at the federally inspected plants, they are inspected by federal inspectors that are part of FSIS. And the result of having meat processed in one of those plants is it can be sold in interstate and even international commerce. So you can sell it across state lines.
So what is required to go to a federally inspected plant?
If you are a producer, what's required?
If is there any kind of meat that's required to go to a federal inspected plant or a state inspected plant?
Nope, the plant itself makes that choice about what kind of inspection it wants to have. So the difference between a federally inspected plant and a state inspected plant, in addition to one is inspected by the federal government and one is inspected by the state government, is that if you are inspected by the state government in a state inspected plant, you can only sell within that state. So only within the boundaries of Arkansas or Texas or Montana or Illinois. You can't sell across state boundaries, as opposed to that federal plant where you can sell all over the country.
Got it. How is that really enforced from a practical standpoint? Like, for example, if a restaurant, purchases meat, how do they know if everybody is local or if people are coming from out of state, etc.?
There's a different stamp. And so there would be a USDA inspected stamp or a Illinois inspected stamp.
Got
But
it.
not every state has state inspectors. So I think it's 27 of them that have a state inspection program. With a state inspection program, you have to meet the same standards that you would on the federal side. So they are judging you on the same requirements that the federally inspected plants would be judged on. The only difference is, one, it's the state guy that's coming out instead of the federal one, and two, you can only sell it within state boundaries as opposed to across state lines.
So I know you talked a little bit about custom slaughter, but what would be some of the big purposes behind having non-inspected plants?
Well, a lot of times, especially in the fall, many of them they take off hunting season and they process deer. So that's a non-inspected species. When you're talking about livestock, that kind of thing, and number one, it's going to be cheaper because you don't have to meet the same facility standards and food safety standards that you would in a federally inspected or a state inspected plant. And three, it's a different way of doing it. It's doing it for people who want to have the meat themselves. So I would like a quarter of a beef in my freezer, as opposed to people who would rather buy it by the pound.
So I remember a few years ago, mobile slaughter units for poultry were quite the rage. Would that fit into a non-inspected facility?
Actually, typically those mobile slaughter units are federally inspected. And the reason for that is because they're so expensive. And so because they're so expensive, when you have them inspected, there's a little bit more return on investment. Additionally, a lot of those mobile slaughter units were paid for by federal grants. There's a program that FSIS had a few years back, and part of that requirement was that they have the inspected part of it.
Interesting. So I'm curious, Beth, for folks like me and other producers that are trying to get into direct marketing with beef, try, as you mentioned, selling a whole goat or, quarters of beef, things along those lines, what would be your suggestions to those producers?
So are you interested in selling them custom, or are you interested in selling by the pound? That's going to be your first question.
Okay. So what would
And
be the difference? Let's say it's custom first.
if you're interested in selling them custom, you're basically going to do what you've been doing. You have to identify the owner of every part of that animal before it is delivered to the custom slaughter facility. So for example, if you want to do that with a beef, you would have to make sure that all 4/4 or 7/8 or 1/2 plus 2/4, however it is, adds up to an entire animal before you sell it, before you take it to the slaughtering facility. You can be the owner of that last quarter if you can't find anybody to buy it. But when that's the case, you are going to be taking it home and putting it in your freezer and not selling it to anybody. You have to sell it before that time, while it's still alive. The other thing I would say is a point that you brought up. You have to make sure that you plan ahead of what you want to do. Because if you are if you're trying to sell custom, if you're trying to sell on the hoof, but you're not able to get a processing date until 8 months out, a year out, 18 months out, obviously you're not going to be able to use that same animal. You have to know what your plan is and plan ahead and make those arrangements before that animal is even ready to be sold.
Got it. Okay, so let's say you're not wanting to sell custom, you're wanting to sell by the pound. What would be your suggestion then?
Again, you're going to want to make sure that you plan ahead, because just as the custom slaughter facilities have dates that are months out, so do the inspected ones. So the first thing you're going to want to do is figure out who your market is going to be. Is it going to be people within the state of New York, or is it going to be people across the country? And if it's people within the state of New York, then you can have a state inspected plant. If it's people across the country, you have to make sure that it is a federally inspected one. Okay? So after you figured that out, you have to call around to the different plants, make sure that they have the right inspection that you want them to have, and set a date. On that date, you take the animals there, and they'll call you when the meat is done. You made those decisions as to how you want it processed, and you take it home. If you are planning on doing that, you should be in touch with your health department, your county health department, and or your state health department to make sure that you are following all the requirements of having, so your freezer requirements and your storage requirements to sell that meat by the pound from your house.
So
Same
Beth,
with shipping. If you're planning on shipping it, make sure that you're meeting those health department requirements for shipping.
oh man, shipping, that's a whole other ball of wax. So
Right.
good point there. So Beth, I know we started off with you saying that the National Ag Law Center is there to provide resources and education for folks. You guys aren't a law firm. So for our listeners that are looking for an attorney to help them guide them through these regulations, what would be your suggestion for those listeners who are looking for somebody who's licensed in their particular jurisdiction?
Well, if they're licensed in one of the many states if they're looking for one of the many states you're licensed in, that would be my first suggestion. If not, the American Agricultural Law Association is a group of attorneys that practice ag law. And if you go to their website, all the way down at the bottom of the homepage is a map that has links to the different members in different states that they live in. You can see if there's one that lives in your state that may be interested in working with you. And even if they are not, or they can't, they might have somebody that they can recommend.
And last question, Beth, what has been the biggest silver lining for you during this pandemic?
I don't know, man. Well, I mean, personally, I just had a child not too long ago, about 6 weeks ago. My son is just, I guess, a month, 2 months now. So that's sort of a silver lining. I guess another one is that we are definitely not bored. There's been so many different things that last time I thought of was I was in law school, and all of a sudden, it's really important to know what happens in how a force majeure clause can be implemented. Things that I never thought I'd hear again. And now people are asking all kinds of questions about them.
Yeah, I think at one point in my life, I had to negotiate a force majeure clause in a contract. I'm like, oh, all these hypothetical situations, these are never going to come up. And now here I am,
Right.
rethinking every single contract I've ever reviewed, and
Exactly.
wondering if it's pandemic proof. So
Things that you never thought you'd see again. So I mean, it's sort of cool to think about these things in light of such a very different situation.
absolutely. In closing, how can people contact you?
My best way is through email, and that's erumley, that's E-R-U-M as in Mary, L-E-Y, at uark.edu. And something I do pretty often, you asked how people could get in touch with attorneys. If folks cannot find an attorney in their area, if they send me an email with sort of a one-paragraph description of what they're looking for, I will send it out on the ALA listserv, which goes out to attorneys across the country, and I will let them know what pops up, what attorneys are interested in talking with them in their area.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time and expertise. Appreciate it.
Thank you. It was good to talk to you.